Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So in honor of the release of Raya and the Last Dragon, the 59th Disney animated classic, I thought it'd be a fun time if we went through my picks for the top 10 Disney animated classics of all time. Yes, we are going to be going through the very best that Walt Disney Studios has had to offer in the last almost 100 years. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Disney animated classics are an official list of animated films that have been released by Walt Disney Studios, starting with the very first from 1939 being Snow White. And as I said, the latest addition to this list was indeed Raya and the Last Dragon. So it's not all of the animated films that Disney comes out with that are included as part of this prestige group. So this is a very official list. This is a very, very big deal. And so when I tell you that I'm literally sweating through my pits right now, because I am so nervous about this video, you best believe that is the case, because I've already done my videos on the top 10 picks from Pixar and from DreamWorks Animation, which you can check out on my channel. But here I'm really laying down all of my cards here. Okay, here I'm really exposing myself in a very vulnerable way, because these films mean a ton to me. So this list is pretty nerve-wracking. I've been thinking about this for days now, but we're gonna do it. As per usual, I'd like to include a little disclaimer, okay, because this list is of course based on fact. It's based in fact, okay, make no mistake, but it's also somewhat based on my opinion. Listen, okay, those who might disagree, okay, just keep in mind it is based in my opinion and it's based on my experiences, because as per usual, a lot of these animated films have a very nostalgic tie to me. And also keep in mind that because I grew up in the early noughties, I will obviously have a bias towards films that came out before or during that time. But now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's dive into my list of the top 10 Disney animated classics of all time. So first off, at number 10, we have Moana. Now, this excellent recent entry into the Disney animated classics pantheon explored a culture that we've never seen the Disney animated classics explore before, that being the culture of the Pacific Islanders. And here this story centers on the character of Moana, who is, much like many of our other protagonists in these films, a trailblazer. She wants to take a different path to the one that has been set out for her, and so in a lot of ways she does follow that kind of general blueprint for a lot of these protagonists in these films. But what makes Moana really stand out to me is that she's genuinely just such a caring and charismatic character. I very much enjoyed her interactions with Maui. I think that the friendship that grew between them was amazing. I also like the fact that even though she is a very headstrong young woman, which we've again often seen, especially in these recent Disney animated films, she still opened up to have a friendship with him, and she still was humble enough to admit when she was wrong so that they could work together as a team in order to get where they needed to go. And as is the case with a lot of the recent Disney animated classics, we do have the exploration, like I said, of a culture that is seldom seen in cinema overall, but in particular in the Disney animated classics pantheon, and that was the Pacific Islander culture. And I found that absolutely fascinating, the way that they explored that culture, on top of how beautifully the island was animated. Wow. Wow. I mean, we're going to be going through a ton of incredible animation in this video, but can I just say that the way that Moana is animated is truly stunning. The breathtaking views that we get of the island, of the seas, and in particular the waters as well, because for those of you who don't know, for the longest time, one of the hardest things to animate, especially using 3D animation, was water, just because of the way that it moves and trying to mimic that movement, that natural movement that water has. It was incredibly difficult. So films like Moana pretty much had to be pushed until the technology was available in order to do them justice, because it's so water based, it's so focused on the water and Moana's relationship with it, that it wouldn't have been possible in the early days of 3D animation. Now, I will say what holds Moana back from being higher up on my list, despite the fact that I very much enjoyed the film, is the fact that it kind of follows into this recent trend. It kind of follows into this recent trend of these Disney animated classics not really having a strong villain, and that is one of the criterias that I look for when I'm trying to decide, you know, what really stands out to me in a Disney animated classic. What is the villain like? Well, in the case of Moana, it doesn't really commit to the traditional bad guy, you know, mustache twirling type of villain, but rather the villain is kind of nature. It's kind of arbitrary without giving anything away, and as a result I don't feel like the villain very much stands out to me personally in the film. I do still think that the heroine is strong enough and unique enough to stand out from the crowd, especially considering the ocean the literal ocean that the Disney animated classics have given us in terms of previous heroes. I'll also say what holds Moana back from being higher up on my list are the sidekicks that she has throughout the film. I don't find them to be particularly memorable, okay? I mean, they are really up against some incredible, memorable, legendary sidekicks. So this category is incredibly competitive, and I have to say that they just don't hold up. I'm so sorry to Moana's friends, the pig and the chicken, but and another thing that I would say holds back the film somewhat is the lack of really amazing songs. Now, songs are just they are one of the key features of the Disney animated classics, and in recent times I feel like that's kind of been lost a little bit, much to my sadness. I have to say that Moana very much resembles some of the earlier Disney animated classics that we saw previously, in that there is an attempt to have, you know, songs and very memorable musical numbers in there. She is a singing character, so I appreciate the presence of these songs, and I very much enjoyed How Far I'll Go, You're Welcome, and in particular Where You Are. I think that's my favorite of the bunch, but overall it's tough competition when it comes to musical numbers in these films. So we're already starting off strong here, but at number 9 we have Zootopia. Now, speaking of a film that doesn't really feature a ton of musical numbers, but Zootopia has a lot to offer otherwise, because here we have a very clever animated film that attempts to tackle some really complex issues, to the point where you almost think that it's a Pixar film because of the kind of intellectual and complex issues that it tries to tackle in terms of its representation of society and how it's depicted here in the form of this Zootopia, which is essentially a metropolis that is comprised of animals as opposed to human beings. And here at the center of the story we have a bunny and a fox who have incredible chemistry, which brings me to another category that I look out for when it comes to Disney animated classics, and that is excellent casting. Because I truly think that Jennifer Goodwin and Jason Bateman being cast as the roles of Judy Hopps and Nick Wilde is absolute genius casting, especially Jason Bateman, because he is the fox. He really is. Like, his voice work in this film is truly excellent, but it's just one of many excellent performances in this film. We also have Idris Elba just there just there, and that automatically gives you extra points. Another thing that I particularly loved about Zootopia was the world building. This film took full advantage of the premise that it set out with and built this gorgeous world, this gorgeous metropolis that is so diverse in not only the beings that live within it, but the environments in which they live, because it is truly astounding to see how they've taken this concept and just gone wild with it. We see places that represent different ecological systems, as well as places that have been adapted in order to suit the individuals that live there. It's just so clever. It really is just so clever. And to see, you know, polar bears living in the Arctic that was created for them in this city, and then you also have these smaller towns for these smaller rodent species. It's so clever. Okay, so next up, we're no longer playing games. Okay, the warm-up is over. We're in this now, because at number 8 we have The Little Mermaid. Yes. Now look, as much as I enjoy this film, and I will be talking about all of the reasons why I think it's so excellent, right off the bat I need to say this, okay? I don't like the character of Ariel. I personally find Ariel to be quite annoying. She's one of my least favorite Disney princesses, but the fact of the matter is that the film that she's surrounded by is so excellent that it almost doesn't matter. Almost doesn't matter. Okay, first off, let's get this out of the way quickly, okay, because it needs to be said. The songs in The Little Mermaid are unmatched. They are unparalleled. unparalleled. Almost almost unparalleled. Okay, it's truly impressive. Almost every single song, no, every single song on that soundtrack bangs. Every single one, even Le Poisson, if you've heard it enough times, you're bopping your head. Yes, you are, because it's truly excellent songwriting in that film. But then you also have the animation, the way that they realized the ocean. Okay, we were just talking about Moana, but in this case we have the traditional 2D animation, and it realized the ocean so beautifully. It created the world of Atlantis so beautifully. I was so impressed with this film. I recently rewatched it to consider it for this list, and I was like, oh, this is excellent. This is actually amazing. And the thing is about the 2D animation, at least in my eyes, is that it just feels so timeless. It truly does feel like a forgotten art form, and I really do appreciate the way that they illustrated the backgrounds, especially when you have, you know, the traditional animation where the background is still and you can see that it was painstakingly drawn by hand, but then the moving components are in the forefront, so you can see the difference between that. It kind of creates a little bit of a disconnect, but I love that. It's just so classically 2D animation. But again, like I said, we have the songs, we have the gorgeous world building, oh my goodness, but then we have the villain. Remember what I said, that I have a true appreciation for excellent villains? Yeah, Ursula, excellent villain. First of all, her villain song, almost unmatched, almost unparalleled, quite frankly. Secondly, she wasn't entirely wrong. Okay, let's discuss. Ursula made a deal with Ariel. She made her sign a legally binding contract. And Ariel had to turn to her daddy, okay? She had to turn to her king father in order to get her out of it. Listen, as someone who wants to go into law, I don't know how I feel about that, okay? Not to mention it was all her fault anyway, because she fell in love with a prince that she didn't even know. Okay, she didn't even know who Prince Eric was, but she was willing to give it all away for him. I have to say, Ursula as a villain was truly astonishing. She is an imposing figure. She is a terrifying figure. And at the same time, like I said, she is not entirely wrong, which makes her even more compelling. Now, speaking of Prince Eric, since he is the very first Disney prince that we will be discussing in this video, since the other two didn't really feature Disney princes in the traditional way because they are more modern films, I do have to say that when it comes to him as a prince, for the longest time, I did give him a lot of slack because I was like, Prince Eric sucks. He falls in love with a woman who's essentially mute. Like, he doesn't care about Ariel's contributions to a conversation. He just finds her physically attractive, blah, 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 blah. And that's all true. Like, that's all valid. But at the same time, I do feel like, having watched it recently, he's not as bad. He's not as bad as I made him out to be, okay? He does have a personality. He's not like Prince Philip or Prince, was it Charming? His name was literally Prince Charming from Cinderella. He's not as bad as those two, but you know, there is an attempt to give him a bit more of a personality and to actually show him falling in love with this girl. But like I said, she's not able to converse with him. And if I thought that this was a commentary on Prince Philip falling in love with someone who is actually mute and loving them despite this, then I would have given the film a little bit more props. But something tells me that that's not the case, okay? Especially in a film that values a voice so much. I don't think that's what they were going for. And lastly, like I mentioned, another thing that I like to look out for are these sidekick characters. And how can you beat Sebastian and Flounder? Truly, like, how can you beat Sebastian and Flounder? They are iconic. They are legendary. Sebastian is an excellent musician, so truly he has the most talent out of all of the sidekicks. So yeah, I definitely think that The Little Mermaid gets a leg up just based on their excellence. Now, next up at number 7, we have the criminally underrated Treasure Planet. Now look, okay, I will never forgive you guys for allowing this film to flop. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This film is excellent. But unfortunately, this film came out at a rough time for Walt Disney Pictures in the early 2000s, after it had gone through this huge renaissance with its animated studios. And unfortunately, this film did end up being a flop and forgotten by many, but not by me. Not by me, because as I mentioned, I grew up watching a lot of the films from the early noughties, and this was one of them. This is truly spectacular. And I have to mention that this film very much deserves to join the ranks of The Mandalorian in the single father parenting category because at the heart of this story, that is what it's really about. It's about this touching relationship that develops between Jim and John Silver as they travel across the cosmos to find this hidden treasure. And this story is loosely based off of the Robert Louis Stevenson book Treasure Island, but here we're dealing with a story that takes place in space and it is so beautifully realized here as well. Now here, interestingly enough, we do have this combination of 2D and 3D animation, and at parts it does look a little bit jarring to see the two styles of animation come together, but I do think that this film is admirable in its attempt to try and incorporate the best of 2D animation and 3D animation in order to create a more textured world that you could really dive into, because I think again that the world building in this film is truly magical. It's truly spectacular, and as you can probably see as a running theme here, I love the fact that each of the planets that they visit in this film has its own personality, has its own defined characteristics. I think that just helps the world building so much, and in terms of making the film so memorable, I do think that it goes a long way. Now speaking of memorable, in my humble opinion, I would say that the character of Jim in Treasure Planet is one of the most memorable male protagonists that the Disney animated classics have ever given us. Now this is key because for the longest time, you know, the Disney animated classics seem to be geared towards its female audiences, especially with the prevalence of the Disney princesses. And so here in the early 2000s when this film came out, there was a strong attempt by Disney to try and gain a growing male audience, and as a result you did see the prevalence of more male protagonists in their films. But I will say that when it comes to the cosmos of male protagonists that Disney gave us, I would say that Jim is very much one of the more memorable ones. And finally, in terms of songs, this is yet another film that doesn't really feature any strong musical numbers, but I will say that I'm Still Here is one of my favorite songs from any of the Disney animated films. It's not even the featured song. I believe the featured song is Always Know Where You Are, but I'm Still Here is the song that I listen to the most by far. Next up at number 6, we have Pocahontas. Now, before we dive into all of the reasons why I absolutely adore this film, we must address some of the controversies that surround it. Of course, one of them being its representation of Native American peoples not being great, okay? Quite frankly, it really was a film of its time, and maybe even behind its time, because a lot of Native American activists did speak out upon this film's release, saying that its representation of their culture was quite deplorable. So that is very unfortunate. But I would say when it comes to viewing this film now as someone who is a little bit more aware of the, you know, socio-political implications of it, I personally now just strip away its historical context entirely because it makes no sense. Like, it really isn't historically accurate in the slightest. We know that Pocahontas wasn't the age that she's depicted in the film. She was much younger, and she was kind of coerced in this relationship with John Smith in a way that is quite despicable, quite horrible, just another symptom of awful colonial practices. So it's not a representation of the truth is what I'm trying to say. And when I see this film now, I just take away, you know, historical context from it entirely, because otherwise it's just going to be unwatchable. But in terms of the film that we do end up with, I still think it's absolutely stunning. This is one of the films that pretty much raised me. If I'm being honest, like, I used to watch Pocahontas on the daily, okay? I knew every single lyric to every single song. I absolutely loved the character of Pocahontas. I think she's an incredible, free-spirited young woman who's just so admirable. The things that she stood for in this film, this idea of unity and this idea of love over war and hatred, are still lessons that could be learned, that could stand to be learned by a lot of us to this day, even though again I do think that it was coming from a more naive perspective because it very much downplayed the impact of colonialism in America. And also, it's not lost on me that this character was sexualized quite a bit, especially if you take a look at the original sketches of the character, which were more akin with the traditional attire that we would see from the actual culture. But they scrapped that. They scrapped that and decided to make her a little bit more of a sexual being, which is not something that we saw with her white counterparts, notably. Okay, yes, I did notice, okay, but at the same time, I still think that she is a stunning Disney princess to be a part of the Disney princess pantheon. I think her songs are incredible. Colors of the Wind, hands down, no questions asked, my favorite Disney animated classic song of all time. There, I've laid out my heart to you all. Colors of the Wind is my very favorite. I love that song. I can't even listen to it often because it just makes me so teary-eyed. It makes me so nostalgic. And I also particularly love the animation of this film. I love the watercolor effects that they used here. It makes it very distinct from all of the other animated films that we've gotten. Again, considering the fact that it is 2D animation as opposed to 3D animation, you know, sometimes a lot of that 2D animation can start to look a little bit samey. I love this technique that they used with the 2D animation to create the sense of watercolor work as opposed to the other 2D animation that we've gotten previously from Disney of the 1980s and 70s, which looked scratchier, it looked a bit harsher. Here we have these beautiful blurred lines. We have everything that seems to kind of blend together so wonderfully, again, like watercolors, and I think it helps distinguish the animation style of the film substantially. And keep in mind that this was actually done by Disney Animation's A team at the time, because they were focused on getting the awards recognition for this film, whilst the B team worked on a certain other film that we may be seeing featured perhaps on this list. Now, in terms of the love interest in Pocahontas, it's quite unfortunate to me. It's quite unfortunate to me that he was voiced by Mel Gibson. Listen, I'm just as upset as you are, quite frankly, because yes, I may have had a mild crush on him growing up. So to hear that he was voiced by Mel Gibson, and then I found out the reason why that's such a terrible thing, ugh, disappointment. True, disappointing all around, okay? But speaking of villains, let's turn our attention to the fictional one in this film, that of course being the villain of Ratcliffe. Now, he in himself is not the most memorable villain, but what he represents is very important, because he represents colonialism. Listen, I love to see it, okay? He represents colonialism, he represents the harsh realities of colonialism, and I feel like they tried to kind of push this idea that Ratcliffe was only interested in exploitation of the land and of the peoples, which was a very real thing in reality, you know, in history. Again, because it's Disney, it was kind of sugar-coated, but still, what he stands for is very real. This idea that they only wanted gold, that they only wanted to exploit the land and didn't have any appreciation for the history, the culture, and the peoples that actually lived there is a very real concept that I'm glad that the film touched on, even though the way that it did so was flawed. Okay, so now things are really starting to heat up because we're at the top 5 now, and at number 5 we have Aladdin. Now, speaking of excellent casting choices, speaking of memorable side characters, we must start off this entire tirade with the genie himself, who was incredibly voiced by Robin Williams. Okay, an iconic character, truly, because even though a lot of the references that the genie makes in the original Aladdin may not have held up throughout time because they were very, you know, culturally relevant of that time and of that moment, the genie is honestly one of the most, if not the very most, hilarious character of all of the side characters in these 59 films. But that's not to ignore the main star, the titular character, by any means, because Aladdin is also an excellent male protagonist. Now, he was the very first, I believe, male protagonist to kind of switch things up, and instead of him being a Disney prince, he actually ends up marrying a Disney princess in order to become a prince. So we see this love story play out throughout the film, and I would say that this is one of the best examples of a love story playing out in a Disney animated film, especially for that era where girls seem to be falling in love with anyone, any random good-looking guy in these animated films, okay? Like, they weren't given much credit at all. But here we have Aladdin really having to work for it, and I appreciate that. And this is especially important because she was, I believe, the very first Disney princess of color, so the representation there was incredibly important. Although I will say again, we do see a running theme in terms of the representation of women of color in these Disney films and how they are depicted in a very overtly sexual way. Okay, you can't look me in the eye and tell me that Jasmine's costume is period typical, because it certainly is not. So that's duly noted, but still, she is a very empowering character. She does have her own sense of autonomy in the film. I would say when it comes to that kind of character, she's not particularly the strongest one, because Disney has done a better job of depicting that kind of female character as of late. But still, you can see an early attempt there to make her such a character, and that is once again noted. Now, Aladdin also scores top marks when it comes to the other criteria that I like to look for in these films. We have excellent sidekicks. Like I said, the genie is truly like the number one sidekick of them all. But then we also have Abu and the magic carpet. I mean, how can you give a personality to a carpet? Well, Aladdin answers that question pretty impressively. And of course, we have a villain, an incredible villain in Jafar, who is more of a political villain. He is someone who's looking to gain political power, which is interesting. Although I would say that little angle where he's trying to make Jasmine his bride is slightly icky. Okay, we could have done without that. And next up, at number 4, we have yet another criminally underrated film in Hercules. Now listen, listen, you might be surprised by the very high placement of this film, but let me tell you, first of all, as I said, it's criminally underrated, and you likely haven't even watched the film at least in 10 years, so please go check it out. But secondly, this is yet another example of a film that essentially raised me. Essentially, like literally raised me. When I tell you that I watched Hercules repeatedly as a child, to the point where it likely even taught me English. Like, Hercules is a huge deal in this household, okay? So first off, you want to talk about incredible male protagonists in these Disney animated classics, Hercules would probably be my number 1. I think he is such an incredible character. He has heart, he has strength, he has courage, okay? And he loves, oh my god, he wears his heart on his sleeve, especially with Meg, who we'll talk about in a second. And not only that, but he is derived from Greek mythology. And that's another reason why this film holds such a dear place in my heart, because I do believe it's the source of my passion, my love for Greco-Roman mythology. Seeing this film as a child just inspired me when it came to all of these stories that were being told, and then finding out the real life stories that were believed thousands of years ago. And you know, they are notably less PG than what is displayed here in this film, but it really did inspire this love of Greco-Roman mythology that pretty much spanned my entire life up until now. So I have to give it props for that at the very least. But then you also have an amazing protagonist in the form of Hercules, who goes through this substantial character arc. I mean, we are talking about a character who changes physically, who changes mentally, emotionally, okay? For example, he sets about trying to be a hero so that he can join his father in Olympus after finding out that he is a demigod. But then he gets lost along the way. His morals become clouded as he becomes seduced by fame and by fortune. And it's only the people around him like Meg and Phil, voiced by Danny DeVito, another excellent choice for an animated character, who are able to kind of realign his morals and his priorities. But then there's an extra twist where it turns out that Meg isn't even someone that he can trust. She has been coerced by Hades, who we'll talk about in a second. She's been coerced by Hades because he has control of her soul after she gave it up for yet another man, yet another useless man. It's just such a jumble of themes that are being explored here, and again, it can actually be quite relatable if you strip away, you know, the premise of Greek mythology and the story device of Hercules trying to become a demigod, or rather a real god, by the end of the film. As I've already mentioned Hades, let's get right into it right now, because he is one of the best Disney villains of all time, point blank period. Point blank period. He is incredible. First off, I would rank James Woods, who voices Hades, in the ranks of Jeremy Irons, who voices Scar, because his voice work in this film is truly astonishing. He seems to exist in a different era in comparison to the other characters in Hercules, although there are a lot of contemporary references throughout the film that kind of tie it back to the 90s, very much so. But I do think that the character of Hades really stands out in the way that he is this kind of zany, edgy type of character, but at the same time he does have that menacing underlayer, first of all because of the way that he he is realized in animation, which is truly impressive. Like, he is a terrifying character, and I used to genuinely be afraid of him when I was younger. But secondly, because of those threats, because of those moments where you realize he's no longer joking, he's no longer being satirical, he's being fully serious. He has his eyes on the prize, trying to bring back the titans of old in order to defeat his brother. And so you see that kind of duality in his character, where at times he very much is this smooth, wise guy who seems to live in this completely different era in comparison to the other characters, but then in the other times he does get quite angry. Now, next up, as I mentioned, we need to discuss Meg, because I do think she's a very interesting Disney character. She doesn't quite class as a Disney princess, because technically she's just a love interest of a demigod, but she's a very interesting character in that she's presented as being quite duplicitous. She's actually a liar. She's actually someone who deceives Hercules because she's working for Hades, because he has full control of her soul. So at first their relationship isn't as genuine because she's hiding that huge truth from him, but you see him fall in love with her genuinely. And again, you have a character who is just so wholesome. I mean, he's really a Steve Rogers of the Disney animated classics roster, okay? He's so wholesome, he wears his heart on his sleeve, that to see him fall in love with a character who is hiding so much from him is quite heartbreaking, until the very end, where she has no choice but to admit that she's falling for him also. And that is such a huge revelation that comes in the film, and it comes in the form of one of the best musical numbers in any film ever. Because yes, we have the muses in Hercules, and is that a large reason why I think this film really does trump so many of the other Disney animated classics? Absolutely. The muses are untouchable. The muses are amazing. They make that film, that injection of gospel music in a film that is about Greek mythology. Excellent. Genius. I mean, who came up with that tie of different kinds of religion being brought together to make this film is just truly phenomenal. And not to mention the soundtrack bangs. Once again, every single song is a bop. Every single song is an A++. Okay, so now we're in the top 3. The stakes are very, very high here. At number 3, we have Mulan. Now, I already talked pretty much at length about how much I adore the film of Mulan in my review of the live action remake, where I was quite generous. Listen, in hindsight, I would say I was quite generous of that remake in comparison to, you know, some of the scrutiny that I would have given another live action remake. But I have to say, it's because it's Mulan. This is yet another film that raised me, guys. Like, I've seen the film of Mulan so many times at this point. It's a part of my DNA. It's a part of my biological makeup. The film means so much to me. First of all, we have a character that is truly iconic. She was one of the most powerful, inspirational Disney princesses that we had ever gotten, especially at that point. She is a warrior. She is someone who's willing to risk her life in order to save her father's life and fight for what she believes in. And not to mention, she's incredibly intelligent. She uses a lot of her intellect, she uses a lot of her skills, as well as being able to look at things from a different perspective because she is a woman. And I also did appreciate the relationships and the friendships that she was able to make with those in the army, and the amount of respect that they gained for her after she was able to prove herself time and time again. And speaking of relationships, let's talk about Li Shang. Let's talk about Li Shang, because he was yet another missed element of the live action remake from last year. Li Shang, Li Shang, okay, that is a character and a half. That is a male love interest and a half. That's all I'll say. Okay, he's an animated character. I need to calm down. That's all I will say. Since we're already on the topic of Li Shang, we need to talk about his song I'll Make a Man Out of You. Classic. Literally one of my most played songs ever. Okay, just in general, outside of the Disney animated classic songs. It is truly iconic. I love the sequence that accompanied it in the original film, because of course you have the beautiful animation that is used here. Again, we have the watercolor inspiration, except this time around it is very reminiscent of Eastern Asian art. So it's truly beautiful to see how these watercolors blend into one another. You could see the artistic inspirations that were used by the animators from Asian art in order to bring this world to life. And the film overall does have a couple of other excellent songs, like A Girl Worth Fighting For, or of course Reflection, and indeed Honor to Us All, which I think is my second favorite of the entire film, because I just love that entire sequence. Now, I would say if there was any weak elements to this film, it would probably be the villain. I feel like the villain of the film wasn't as strong as some of the other villains that we have gotten previously, especially on this list. I mean, just look at the evidence, right? Which leads us to number 2, which in my opinion has an excellent villain. And here at number 2 we have The Princess and the Frog. Now listen, up until now you've seen this list be propagated by a ton of Disney animated classics, Renaissance period projects, but here we have a more recent entry in The Princess and the Frog. And I actually recently talked about my love for this film in my Black History Month 2021 video, which you can check out to learn more about my picks on that front. But I absolutely love The Princess and the Frog. First of all, look at me. look at me. Tell me you're surprised that The Princess and the Frog is on this list. I'll wait. Oh, you're not. You can't be. If you've been paying attention, you wouldn't be. The Princess and the Frog, of course, was going to make an appearance on this list because Princess Tiana is the very first Black Disney princess. So, of course, she holds a very special place in my heart. So that was without a doubt. But yes, it is quite high on the list, but I will justify this, okay? First of all, as I mentioned previously, I think that the villain of this film, Dr. Facilier, is incredibly underrated. Because first off, he's a witch doctor, okay? He's a voodoo man, okay, a voodoo master. So that's a very interesting tie there into the setup of the film, which takes place in New Orleans of the 1920s. It kind of buys into that culture of New Orleans and voodoo and practicing of voodoo and dark magic and all of that, which is, yes, a stereotype, okay, but it does kind of feed into the history of Black people in that region. So it doesn't come out of nowhere is what I'm trying to say. But also what I find very interesting about Dr. Facilier is the fact that he's not even the big bad of this film. Okay, I was just talking about big bads when it came to WandaVision a couple of days ago, but in this case, he's not the big bad, okay, because there is actually a Mephisto in this film. It's like these dark gods, like these demons that are following him and demanding that he pay up in terms of souls because apparently he owes them a debt. And so that's never really explored, and that's something that should have been explored in a sequel, but maybe it'll be explored in the Disney Plus show. But that's what I find fascinating about Dr. Facilier is the fact that he's also working for a top boss that he needs to answer to, and in the end when he doesn't, he suffers the consequences not by the hands of the heroes and the protagonists, but by that top boss. And also when it comes to the signature Disney villain musical number, I would say that Dr. Facilier is definitely up there. First of all, because of the visuals. The visuals for the Friends on the Other Side sequence are truly spectacular. They are creepy as hell, they are terrifying, but they're also visually distinct from the rest of the film, just as Princess Tiana's numbers are visually distinct from the rest of the film. So I absolutely love the animation that is used in the Friends on the Other Side sequence, especially seeing these neon colors and the way that they're hypnotizing you just as the gang are being hypnotized by Dr. Facilier and his dark magic. It's just so clever. But then of course you have the song itself. The song itself is truly clever, trying to seduce Prince Naveen into giving Dr. Facilier what he wants, when in reality he's not going to get anything out of it because he ends up turning into a frog. And speaking of turning into a frog, I did mention in my Black History Month video that one of the downsides of this film is that the Black female character, who we're all so excited to see, does end up taking on a frog form for the majority of her own runtime in her own film, because unfortunately some genius Disney exec decided that seeing a frog on screen would be better than seeing a Black woman. Whatever. I'm not bitter at all anyway, so that is a downside when it comes to this film. Although the representation is important, it is still flawed, as I mentioned in the case of Pocahontas. But still, I do think that the character of Tiana gets to shine bright in her film. She is truly an inspirational Disney princess who works hard, who is passionate about the work that she is doing, and she's able to set this goal for herself and achieve that goal through that hard work in a way that we've never really seen a lot of the other Disney princesses previously because they've never really had to. Okay, it seems as though that the only people who have to really work hard to get what they want are the people of color. And as per usual, when it comes to the films that are higher up on this list, I mean, we have excellent music, Almost There, classic, but actually my personal favorite is Dig a Little Deeper from this film. I absolutely love that sequence. And also it's the moment that Prince Naveen realizes that he is in love with Tiana, which is so adorable. If only they weren't in frog form when this happened. Whatever, I need to get over it. But I also love the song My Belle Evangeline that Ray sings. And speaking of Ray, I think he's an incredible side character. I think the side characters in this film are also really charismatic and lovable. And finally, it wouldn't be a complete review of The Princess and the Frog without mentioning the prince himself, Prince Naveen. Listen, I love Prince Naveen, okay? I think he's the best Disney prince by far. I think everyone else is slacking, quite frankly. The relationship that develops between him and Tiana feels real. It feels genuine, okay? You can buy into that love story so well, even though they do take the form of frogs as it's happening. I also think he's one of the first princes that, again, has to work hard for Tiana's affections and for her attention because she's so preoccupied in her own dreams and her own goals for her life. On top of the fact that he's quite attractive. Okay, so now we have reached the end of my list. We are here at number 1, and honestly, is it even worth me saying, because there was truly never really any doubt, okay? Of course, at number 1 we have The Lion King. I mean, of course, like, did you really expect differently? That's your fault. That's not on me at that point, okay? Of course, The Lion King would be number 1. First of all, you want to talk about characters. You want to talk about protagonists. Simba, going through the character arc, the character journey that he does in this film, please. Simba is one of the most momentous characters in all of animation, simply because he is one of the first characters that kids get to experience, you know, loss through, mourning through, because truly this film set out to give us the very real feeling of loss and of mourning through the death of course, Simba's king father, Mufasa, who is brilliantly voiced by James L. Jones. Listen, you want to talk about incredible vocal acting? This film has it all. I already mentioned the excellence, the phenomenal Jeremy Irons vocal performance as Scar, but of course you also have James L. Jones as Mufasa. I mean, there are some truly incredible vocal performances in this film. But back to the characters for a second here. We have Simba, who is an incredible character that goes through an incredible arc throughout this film, to the point where at times he's quite unlikable. At times he comes across as spoiled and unrelatable, and at times he comes across as bullish as well, and someone who's so stubborn that he won't see what's right in front of him. He needs the enlightenment that he goes through, and so it's very much appreciated and it feels authentic when it happens. But then you also have the character of Mufasa, who, even though he is this incredibly strong presence, he does show that vulnerability. He does show that his son really is the weakness that he has, because he cares so much about his son. He doesn't want to allow anything bad to happen to him. Oh, it's such a touching story. And the death scene, the stampede, what? Nothing else. Nothing else can get me to cry as immediately, even just thinking about it. Wow, well, I'm gonna lose an eyelash. But now we have gone way too far without talking about the big bad of this film, who is of course Scar. He is the one to beat when it comes to Disney animated villains, because he is truly spectacular. As I mentioned already, Jeremy Irons, you know, he's doing the British villain stereotype justice here, because he is so good. And on top of all of this, unlike with most of the other films that I've mentioned on this list, here we have a film where pretty much every single character is excellent. Every single character, whether it be Zazu, whether it be Rafiki, whether it be Timon and Pumbaa, are you kidding me? The pair that spawned a dozen TV spin-offs, like, they're excellent. Or even the hyenas, like, all of the characters that have a speaking role in this film are brilliant. Like, how can you even explain that? And then on top of this, you also have the soundtrack, I mean, I was just talking about The Little Mermaid being unbeatable, but this was the caveat, okay? This was the caveat that came with that, because the Lion King soundtrack is truly untouchable. Like, nothing compares. But funnily enough, I would say that my favorite song, or at least my most listened to song from the Lion King soundtrack, would probably be Be Prepared. It's such an excellent sequence, visually speaking as well, the way that the color story changes from the warmth of Pride Rock to this cool emerald green tone. It's such a clever and truly menacing villain song that Scar has there, so I listen to it regularly, okay? It's right up there with Poor Unfortunate Souls to me. But when it comes to the Lion King, truly, just considering all of the criteria that I've been going throughout this video, you can't tell me that it misses on any of them, because it really doesn't. The animation is spectacular, the vocal performances are amazing, the character designs are also incredible. The only thing that I would say puts a little ding on the Lion King is, of course, the story being derivative of Hamlet and and Kimber the White Lion, allegedly, okay, and along with some of the character designs, actually, come to think of it. But that's a whole story for another day. Aside from the possible copyright issues, I think that The Lion King is without a doubt the very best Disney animated classic. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on the top 10 Disney animated classics, it's time for you guys to let me know what your list is down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.